All right, so you know how sometimes you're like just reading something and you have to stop and you're like, wait, hold on, did I just read that right?
Mm-hmm.
Like that
Yeah.
kind of feeling. Well, that's exactly how I felt when I read about how a journalist ended up basically as a fly on the wall for a super secret U.S. military operation.
Oh, wow.
So we're diving deep today into this whole unbelievable story.
I am so ready. This is going to be good.
It's crazy. So, okay, we're talking about this article in The Atlantic, and it's a first-hand account from their editor-in-chief, Jeffrey Goldberg.
Right.
And somehow he gets added to a Signal group chat where senior figures from the Trump administration are talking about, like, coordinating a military strike against Houthi targets in Yemen.
What?
On Signal.
On Signal.
No, wait, this is some spy novel stuff, right? Like, this doesn't happen in real life.
Right. It's wild. And just to like set the scene, this all happens after a bunch of Houthi attacks on Israel and international shipping.
And Goldberg, totally by chance, gets a front row seat to this whole thing, digitally, of course.
Wow. Talk about being in the right place at the right time. Or the wrong place, depending on how you look at it.
Right. I mean, this isn't just some anonymous leak or some secondhand reporting. This is like the journalist was right there in the middle of these high-level discussions in real time. It's nuts.
So where do we even begin with this? Like, what are we trying to figure out here?
Okay, so I think our mission in this deep dive is first, we got to walk through what happened, like step by step.
Okay, yeah.
Then we have to analyze, like, how are these officials even communicating? What methods are they using?
Like, why Signal? Of all things.
Exactly. And then the big question, what does this all mean? Like, what are the implications of this whole thing?
Right. Especially about how, the government works at the highest levels. Like, how do they make decisions? How do they share information? All that.
Exactly. Okay, so let's start at the beginning. It all starts with Goldberg getting a Signal connection request out of the blue.
Okay.
The sender is someone who says they're Michael Waltz. Now, Goldberg had met Waltz before, but still, something just felt off. Like, given how, the Trump administration and the press, they don't always get along.
Yeah.
And Goldberg himself had been kind of scrutinized by them before.
Right.
So he's suspicious, right? He even wonders, like, is this some kind of trap?
Yeah, I mean, that's smart. In today's world, you got to be careful. Like, due diligence is almost automatic,
For sure. But Goldberg decides to accept the request anyway.
He did.
He did. Hoping it really was Waltz.
Yeah.
And that maybe there was a good reason for reaching out, even if it was a little strange.
So what did he think it was about?
He thought maybe Ukraine or Iran, something like that.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, what's the group called?
Houthi PC small group.
Houthi PC small group. Okay, now I'm lost. What's PC?
So PC, that means Principals Committee. It's basically like the top people in national security, the heads of defense, state, Treasury, CIA, like the big decision makers.
Oh, got it. Okay, that makes more sense. But hold on. A commercial messaging app? For something like this? That seems, I don't know, a little off, right? Like, shouldn't they be using something more, secure?
Right. Goldberg even says in the article that he's never heard of a principals committee meeting like this. So yeah, it definitely raises questions about, like, are they following the rules? What about the sensitive information they're talking about?
Yeah, like, why aren't they using the official secure government channels?
Totally. And then you look at who's in the group. It's like a who's who of the Trump administration. You've got MA, which is almost certainly Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, J.D. Vance, the VP, TG, which Goldberg thinks might be Tulsi Gabbard, the Director of National Intelligence, Scott B., probably Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, Pete Hegseth, Secretary of Defense, Brian, representing the NSC, and John Ratcliffe from the CIA, plus a few others. Steve Witkoff, Susie Wiles, and SM, which Goldberg figures is probably Stephen Miller. 18 people in total.
Including Goldberg.
Including Goldberg, yeah.
Wow, okay, so what do they talk about? Like, what's the first thing they say?
So the first message is from Michael Waltz.
Okay.
And he basically says he's making this group to coordinate the whole Houthi situation over the next 72 hours. And he mentions this statement of conclusions with taskings that's in their high side inboxes, which means they're secure, classified communication systems.
So right away, we've got this mix of like really sensitive decisions being talked about on an unsecure app and then mentions of classified documents. It's weird, right? Like, where's the line between official business and this casual chat?
I know, right? It's a strange mix. Okay, so fast forward to Friday morning, March 14th. Michael Waltz sends another message. mentioned that statement of conclusions again and suggests who to notify among the allies. And he says more operational details are coming from the Joint Staff.
Oh.
And this is where things get really interesting, because now some people start pushing back on this whole military action thing.
Oh, really?
J.D. Vance, the VP.
Oh, wow. Okay, what does he say?
So even though he says he's out for the day, he immediately says, this is a mistake. Like, straight up.
Wow. Okay, what are his reasons?
He brings up a few points. He says that the U.S. doesn't have that much trade going through the Suez Canal compared to Europe.
Right.
So he thinks the public might not understand why the U.S. is getting involved. And he says it goes against what the administration's been saying about Europe.
Yeah.
And he's worried about oil prices going crazy if they do this.
Oh, yeah. That's a huge concern. So what does he want to do?
Well, then he says he'll support the consensus of the team and keep these concerns to myself.
Really?
Yeah. But he does suggest maybe delaying the operation.
Yeah.
To, get the message out to the public and see what happens with the economy.
That's interesting. Like, he has all these doubts, but he's still going along with it?
Yeah.
That's politics, I guess. Got to present a united front.
Right.
But it does make you wonder what's really going on behind the scenes.
Totally. And then Joe Kent chimes in.
Who's that?
He's Trump's pick for the National Counterterrorism Center.
Oh, right.
And he's like, hey, there's no rush, right? He doesn't see why they have to act immediately. He thinks they'll have the same options even a month later.
Interesting. So not everyone's on board with this whole gotta do it now thing.
Right. But then Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, jumps in.
Okay, what does he say?
He says he gets what the VP's saying, but he thinks they gotta act now.
Why?
2 reasons. 1, leaks.
Ah, yeah. Classic Washington.
He's worried about leaks making them look weak. And 2, Israel. He thinks Israel might just do it themselves if the U.S. waits.
Oh, or the ceasefire in Gaza could fall apart.
Right. And then they wouldn't be able to do the operation at all.
So it's all about timing and control, basically.
Yeah. But here's the thing. Hegseth, he doesn't really talk about the Houthis as a threat. Instead, he talks about restoring freedom of navigation and reestablishing deterrence.
Which, he's saying, the Biden administration let slip.
Exactly. But then he says they could easily pause the operation if they need to.
So they have an out.
Yeah. And then he says they're going to have 100% OPSC.
Wait, with a journalist right there in the chat.
I know, right?
That's rich.
It's wild. Okay, then Michael Waltz jumps back in.
What does he say?
He starts talking about treat statistics and how the European allies don't have the ships to do this.
Right.
Basically saying it's all on the U.S.
The burden of global leadership.
Right. And then J.D. Vance and Pete Hegseth go back and forth about how it always seems like the U.S. has to bail out Europe.
It's a common theme, right?
Yeah. Hegseth agrees, but he says, hey, the U.S. has the tools for this job.
Interesting. So it's like they see the U.S. as the only one who can do this, but they're not exactly thrilled about it.
Right. A little resentment there, maybe.
Maybe, yeah. Okay, so what happens next?
And then SM, who we think is Stephen Miller, finally speaks up.
Oh, okay. What does he say?
He's like, the president has given the green light.
Okay, so it's a go.
Yeah. But he says they have to tell Egypt and Europe what the U.S. wants in return for this.
Like what?
Like, he actually uses the word remunerate.
Wow.
It's very transactional.
Yeah, maybe even a little, coercive, like,
Yeah.
You better pay up.
Right, and that's kind of the end of the discussion. Pete Hegseth just says, agree, and that's it for Friday.
Wow. So a lot of back and forth, some doubts, but ultimately they decide to go ahead with it.
Yeah, and you really get a sense of how these people might operate, like signal for serious policy talk.
Yeah, that's the part that's really strange.
I know, and Goldberg says that the way they talked, the words they used, it all felt real. But it's mind-blowing that they're having this conversation on an unsecure app with a journalist listening in.
It just doesn't make sense. Like, don't they know about secure communication?
You'd think. Okay, but get this. The next morning, Saturday, March 15th, 11:44 a.m., Pete Hegseth posts a message.
Okay.
It's labeled Team Update. And this is where things get really, really sensitive.
What does he say?
Goldberg doesn't quote it directly, national security and all that.
Right, of course.
But he says it has all the details about the strikes on Yemen, the targets, the weapons, the order of the attacks, like the whole plan.
Wow, they're sharing that on Signal.
I know, right? And the only response, J.D. Vance says, I will say a prayer for victory. with a couple of prayer emojis.
Are you serious?
Yeah.
That's it. That's unbelievable. I mean, they're talking about a military operation, and they're just like thoughts and prayers.
I know, it's just so casual. It's like they don't even realize how serious this is. Or maybe they just don't think signal is a big deal.
Right. Like, how secure do they think this chat really is?
It's bizarre. Okay, so according to the update, the explosions in Yemen are supposed to start in about 2 hours.
Okay.
And Goldberg is in his car checking X, formerly Twitter, and he sees reports of explosions in Sana'a.
Wow.
At around 1:55 p.m. Eastern Time, just like the update said.
That must have been a crazy moment.
I can't even imagine. Like, that's when it really hit him that this was real.
Yeah.
And then the Michael Waltz account posts an update. Amazing job, he says.
Oh, wow.
And then John Ratcliffe, MR, Susie Wiles, Steve Witkoff, and TG all chime in, congratulating everyone. Some of them even talk about how much damage there was, how many casualties.
Wow. So they're celebrating already, before they even know the full story.
Yeah. It's surreal.
What about Goldberg? What does he do?
So Waltz goes on ABC's This Week, that Sunday.
Okay.
And he talks about these strikes, how they're different from what Biden would have done. And that's when Goldberg is like, okay, this is definitely real.
Yeah.
So he leaves the group.
He did. Just like that.
Yeah. And no one even notices.
Seriously.
It's crazy, right? They don't even question why he was there in the first place.
That's unbelievable.
Later that day, Goldberg reaches out to Waltz and some other officials to try and figure out how this even happened.
Yeah, like, how did he get added to this group chat?
Right.
What did they say?
So Brian Hughes, the spokesperson for the National Security Council, he puts out a statement. He confirms the signal group is real.
Okay.
And he says they're reviewing how an inadvertent number was added.
An inadvertent number, huh?
Yeah. And he says the chat shows deep and thoughtful policy coordination.
Oh, come on.
And that the operation was a success.
Right, because success means everything's okay.
And VP Vance's spokesperson says that Vance was totally on board with the president.
Of course.
But this whole thing raises some really serious questions, right?
Yeah, like legal questions, security questions. I mean, they're talking about national defense information on Signal.
Exactly. And some national security lawyers told The Atlantic that this could be a violation of the Espionage Act.
Seriously?
Yeah. They're worried about sharing this kind of information outside of secure government systems. You know, SCIFs, sensitive compartmented information facilities.
Right. And the irony here is just, I mean, it's amazing. Trump was always going after Hillary Clinton for her emails.
Right. But her emails.
Exactly. National security risk, he said. And then he gets indicted for mishandling classified documents himself. And now his people are doing this.
It's a lot to unpack. Like, what are the standards here?
It's a mess. And remember Hegseth's comment in the chat. We are currently clean on OPSE.
Oh, yeah. With a journalist right there listening in.
What does that even mean? OPSEC, clean.
Right.
So what's the takeaway here? Like, what should people be thinking about after listening to all this?
I think the big thing is this isn't just about a journalist accidentally ending up in a top secret chat. It's about how these officials are communicating. Like, they're using Signal for things that should probably be on a much more secure system.
Right. I mean, it makes you think, how common is this? Are they doing this all the time
Have-
for other decisions?
Exactly. And how does that affect how they make decisions, how they share information, especially in these high-pressure situations?
Makes you think about the trade-offs, right? Like convenience versus security.
Yeah. I mean, Signal is easy to use, but is it the right tool for the job when you're talking about national security?
It's a question worth asking. I mean, this whole thing raises a lot of bigger questions, too. Like, how does technology affect national security? How do we balance transparency with keeping things secret? And what about these informal channels? Like, are they good or bad?
That's a lot to think about.
It is, but it's important stuff.
Yeah. And this deep dive, it's given us a glimpse behind the curtain.
A very accidental glimpse.
Yeah, a very accidental glimpse, but still a glimpse. And it's definitely made me think about how these decisions get made.
Me too.
Well, thanks for joining us as we unpack this whole wild story. Until next time.